3. It was the standing regulation, laid down by the German staff, that every Frenchman not belonging to the regular army, taken with arms in his hands, should be shot. Even the company's Franches were not recognized as belligerents. It was the intention of the Germans, in making such terrible examples of the peasants who attempted to defend their firesides, to prevent a rising en masse which they greatly dreaded. The officer, a tall, spare man about 50 years old, subjected Dominique to a brief examination. Although he spoke French fluently, he was unmistakably Prussian in the stiffness of his manner. "You are a native of this country?" "No, I am a Belgian." "Why did you take up arms? These are matters with which you have no concern." Dominique made no reply. At this moment, the officer caught sight of Françoise where she stood listening, very pale. Her slight wound had marked her white forehead with a streak of red. He looked from one to the other of the young people and appeared to understand the situation. He merely added, "You do not deny having fired on my men?" "I fired as long as I was able to do so," Dominique quietly replied. The admission was scarcely necessary, for he was black with powder, wet with sweat, and the blood from the wound in his shoulder had trickled down and stained his clothing. "Very well," the officer repeated. "You will be shot 2 hours hence." Françoise uttered no cry. She clasped her hands and raised them above her head in a gesture of mute despair. Her action was not lost upon the officer. 2 soldiers had led Dominique away to an adjacent room where their orders were to guard him and not lose sight of him. The girl had sunk upon a chair. Her strength had failed her. Her legs refused to support her. She was denied the relief of tears. It seemed as if her emotion was strangling her. The officer continued to examine her attentively and finally addressed her. "Is that young man your brother?" he inquired. She shook her head in negation. He was as rigid and unbending as ever, without the suspicion of a smile on his face. Then, after an interval of silence, he spoke again. "Has he been living in the neighborhood long?" She answered yes, by another motion of the head. "Then he must be well acquainted with the woods about here?" This time, she made a verbal answer. "Yes, sir," she said, looking at him with some astonishment. He said nothing more, but turned on his heel, requesting that the mayor of the village should be brought before him. But Françoise had risen from her chair, a faint tinge of color on her cheeks, believing that she had caught the significance of his questions, and with renewed hope, she ran off to look for her father. As soon as the firing had ceased, Father Merlier had hurriedly descended by the wooden gallery to have a look at his wheel. He adored his daughter and had a strong feeling of affection for Dominique, his son-in-law who was to be, but his wheel also occupied a large space in his heart. Now that the 2 little ones, as he called them, had come safe and sound out of the fray, he thought of his other love, which must have suffered sorely, poor thing, and bending over the great wooden skeleton, he was scrutinizing its wounds with a heartbroken air. 5 of the buckets were reduced to splinters. The central framework was honeycombed. He was thrusting his fingers into the cavities that the bullets had made to see how deep they were, and reflecting how he was ever to repair all that damage. When Françoise found him, he was already plugging up the crevices with moss and such debris as he could lay hands on. "They are asking for you, father," said she, and at last she wept as she told him what she had just heard. Father Merlier shook his head. It was not customary to shoot people like that. He would have to look into the matter. And he re-entered the mill with his usual placid, silent air. When the officer made his demand for supplies for his men, he answered that the people of Rocrous were not accustomed to be ridden roughshod, and that nothing would be obtained from them through violence. He was willing to assume all the responsibility, but only on condition that he was allowed to act independently. The officer at first appeared to take umbrage at this easy way of viewing matters, but finally gave way before the old man's brief and distinct representations. As the latter was leaving the room, the other recalled him to ask, "Those woods there opposite, what do you call them?" "The woods of Sauval." "And how far do they extend?" The miller looked him straight in the face. "I do not know," he replied, and he withdrew. An hour later, the subvention in money and provisions that the officer had demanded was in the courtyard of the mill. Night was closing in. Françoise followed every movement of the soldiers with an anxious eye. She never once left the vicinity of the room in which Dominique was imprisoned. About 7 o'clock, she had a harrowing emotion. She saw the officer enter the prisoner's apartment, and for a quarter of an hour heard their voices raised in violent discussion. The officer came to the door for a moment and gave an order in German which she did not understand. But when 12 men came and formed in the courtyard with shouldered muskets, she was seized with a fit of trembling and felt as if she should die. It was all over then. The execution was about to take place. The 12 men remained there 10 minutes. Dominique's voice kept rising higher and higher in a tone of vehement denial. Finally, the officer came out, closing the door behind him with a vicious bang and saying, "Very well, think it over. I give you until tomorrow morning." And he ordered the 12 men to break ranks by a motion of his hand. Françoise was stupefied. Father Merlier, who had continued to puff away at his pipe while watching the platoon with a simple, curious air, came and took her by the arm with fatherly gentleness. He led her to her chamber. "Don't fret," he said to her. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow it will be light, and we shall see more clearly." He locked the door behind him as he left the room. It was a fixed principle with him that women are good for nothing and that they spoil everything whenever they meddle in important matters. Françoise did not retire to her couch, however. She remained a long time seated on her bed, listening to the various noises in the house. The German soldiers quartered in the courtyard were singing and laughing. They must have kept up their eating and drinking until 11 o'clock, for the riot never ceased for an instant. Heavy footsteps resounded from time to time through the mill itself, doubtless the tramp of the guards as they were relieved. What had most interest for her was the sounds that she could catch in the room that lay directly under her own. Several times she threw herself prone upon the floor and applied her ear to the boards. That room was the one in which they had locked up Dominique. He must have been pacing the apartment, for she could hear for a long time his regular cadenced tread passing from the wall to the window and back again. Then there was a deep silence. Doubtless he had seated himself. The other sounds ceased too. Everything was still. When it seemed to her that the house was sunk in slumber, she raised her window as noiselessly as possible and leaned out. Without, the night was serene and balmy. The slender crescent of the moon, which was just setting behind Sauval Wood, cast a dim radiance over the landscape. The lengthening shadows of the great trees stretched far athwart the fields in bands of blackness, while in such spots as were unobscured, the grass appeared of a tender green, soft as velvet. But Françoise did not stop to consider the mysterious charm of night. She was scrutinizing the country and looking to see where the Germans had posted their sentinels. She could clearly distinguish their dark forms outlined along the course of the Morel. There was only one stationed opposite the mill, on the far bank of the stream, by a willow whose branches dipped in the water. Françoise had an excellent view of him. He was a tall young man, standing quite motionless with face upturned toward the sky, with the meditative air of a shepherd. When she had completed her careful inspection of localities, she returned and took her former seat upon the bed. She remained there an hour, absorbed in deep thought. Then she listened again. There was not a breath to be heard in the house. She went again to the window and took another look outside, but one of the moon's horns was still hanging above the edge of the forest, and this circumstance doubtless appeared to her unpropitious, for she resumed her waiting. At last the moment seemed to have arrived. The night was now quite dark. She could no longer discern the sentinel opposite her. The landscape lay before her black as a sea of ink. She listened intently for a moment, then formed her resolve. Close beside her window was an iron ladder made of bars set in the wall, which ascended from the mill wheel to the granary at the top of the building, and had formerly served the miller as a means of inspecting certain portions of the gearing. But a change having been made in the machinery, the ladder had long since become lost to sight beneath the thick ivy that covered all that side of the mill. Françoise bravely climbed over the balustrade of the little balcony in front of her window, grasped one of the iron bars, and found herself suspended in space. She commenced the descent. Her skirts were a great hindrance to her. Suddenly, a stone became loosened from the wall and fell into the morel with a loud splash. She stopped, benumbed with fear, but reflection quickly told her that the waterfall, with its continuous roar, was sufficient to deaden any noise that she could make, and then she descended more boldly, putting aside the ivy with her foot, testing each round of her ladder. When she was on a level with the room that had been converted into a prison for her lover, she stopped. An unforeseen difficulty came near, depriving her of all her courage. The window of the room beneath was not situated directly under the window of her bedroom. There was a wide space between it and the ladder, and when she extended her hand, it only encountered the naked wall. Would she have to go back the way she came and leave her project unaccomplished? Her arms were growing very tired. The murmuring of the morel, far down below, was beginning to make her dizzy. Then she broke off bits of plaster from the wall and threw them against Dominique's window. He did not hear. Perhaps he was asleep. Again, she crumbled fragments from the wall until the skin was peeled from her fingers. Her strength was exhausted. She felt that she was about to fall backward into the stream, when at last Dominique softly raised his sash. "It is I," she murmured. "Take me quick. I am about to fall." Leaning from the window, he grasped her and drew her into the room, where she had a paroxysm of weeping, stifling her sobs in order that she might not be heard. Then, by a supreme effort of the will, she overcame her emotion. "Are you guarded?" she asked in a low voice. Dominique, not yet recovered from his stupefaction at seeing her there, made answer by simply pointing toward his door. There was a sound of snoring audible on the outside. It was evident that the sentinel had been overpowered by sleep and had thrown himself upon the floor close against the door in such a way that it could not be opened without arousing him. "You must fly," she continued earnestly. "I came here to bid you fly and say farewell." But he seemed not to hear her. He kept repeating, "What, is it you? Is it you? Oh, what a fright you gave me! You might have killed yourself." He took her hands. He kissed them again and again. "How I love you, Françoise! You are as courageous as you are good. The only thing I feared was that I might die without seeing you again. But you are here, and now they may shoot me when they will. Let me but have a quarter of an hour with you, and I am ready." He had gradually drawn her to him. Her head was resting on his shoulder. The peril that was so near at hand brought them closer to each other, and they forgot everything in that long embrace. "Ah, François," Dominique went on in low, caressing tones, "today is the fete of St. Louis, our wedding day that we have been waiting for so long. Nothing has been able to keep us apart, for we are both here, faithful to our appointment, are we not? It is now our wedding morning." "Yes, yes," she repeated after him. "Our wedding morning." They shuddered as they exchanged a kiss, but suddenly She tore herself from his arms. The terrible reality arose before her eyes. "You must fly. You must fly," she murmured breathlessly. "There is not a moment to lose." And as he stretched out his arms in the darkness to draw her to him again, she went on in tender, beseeching tones. "Oh, listen to me. I entreat you. If you die, I shall die. In an hour, it will be daylight. Go at once. I command you to go." Then she rapidly explained her plan to him. The iron ladder extended downward to the wheel. Once he had got that far, he could climb down by means of the buckets and get into the boat, which was hidden in a recess. Then it would be an easy matter for him to reach the other bank of the stream and make his escape. "But are there no sentinels?" said he. "Only one, directly opposite here, at the foot of the first willow." "And if he sees me? If he gives the alarm?" Françoise shuddered. She placed in his hand a knife that she had brought down with her. They were silent. "And your father? And you?" Dominique continued. "But no, it is not to be thought of. I must not fly. When I am no longer here, those soldiers are capable of murdering you. You do not know them. They offered to spare my life if I would guide them into Sauval Forest. When they discover that I have escaped, their fury will be such that they will be ready for every atrocity." The girl did not stop to argue the question. To all the considerations that he adduced, her one simple answer was, "Fly. For love of me, fly. If you love me, Dominique, do not linger here a single moment longer." She promised that she would return to her bedroom. No one should know that she had assisted him. She concluded by folding him in her arms and smothering him with kisses in an extravagant outburst of passion. He was vanquished. He put only one more question to her. "Will you swear to me that your father knows what you're doing and that he counsels my flight?" "It was my father who sent me to you," Françoise unhesitatingly replied. She told a falsehood. At that moment, she had but one great, overmastering longing, to know that he was in safety, to escape from the horrible thought that the morning sun was to be the signal for his death. When he should be far away, then calamity and evil might burst upon her head. Whatever fate might be in store for her would seem endurable, so that only his life might be spared. Before and above all other considerations, the selfishness of her love demanded that he should be saved. "It is well," said Dominique. "I will do as you desire." No further word was spoken. Dominique went to the window to raise it again. But suddenly there was a noise that chilled them with affright. The door was shaken violently. They thought that someone was about to open it. It was evidently a party going the rounds who had heard their voices. They stood by the window, close locked in each other's arms, awaiting the event with anguish unspeakable. Again there came the rattling at the door, but it did not open. Each of them drew a deep sigh of relief. They saw how it was. The soldier lying across the threshold had turned over in his sleep. Silence was restored indeed, and presently the snoring commenced again, sounding like sweetest music in their ears. Dominique insisted that Françoise should return to her room first of all. He took her in his arms, he bade her a silent farewell, then assisted her to grasp the ladder, and himself climbed out on it in turn. He refused to descend a single step, however, until he knew that she was in her chamber. When she was safe in her room, she let fall, in a voice scarce louder than the whispering breeze, the words, "Au revoir, I love you." She knelt at the window, resting her elbows on the sill, straining her eyes to follow Dominique. The night was still very dark. She looked for the sentinel, but could see nothing of him. The willow alone was dimly visible, a pale spot upon the surrounding blackness. For a moment she heard the rustling of the ivy as Dominique descended. Then the wheel creaked, and there was a faint plash which told that the young man had found the boat. This was confirmed when, a minute later, she descried the shadowy outline of the skiff on the grey bosom of the Morel. Then a horrible feeling of dread seemed to clutch her by the throat and deprive her of power to breathe. She momently expected to hear the sentry give the alarm. Every faintest sound among the dusky shadows seemed to her overwrought imagination to be the hurrying tread of soldiers, the clash of steel, the click of musket locks. The seconds slipped by, however, the landscape still preserved its solemn peace. Dominique must have landed safely on the other bank. Françoise no longer had eyes for anything. The silence was oppressive, and she heard the sound of trampling feet, a hoarse cry, the dull thud of a heavy body falling. This was followed by another silence, even deeper than that which had gone before. Then, as if conscious that death had passed that way, she became very cold in presence of the impenetrable night. 4. At early daybreak, the repose of the mill was disturbed by the clamour of angry voices. Father Merlier had gone and unlocked Françoise's door. She descended to the courtyard, pale and very calm, but when they could not repress a shudder upon being brought face to face with the body of a Prussian soldier that lay on the ground beside the well, stretched out upon a cloak. Soldiers were shouting and gesticulating angrily about the corpse. Several of them shook their fists threateningly in the direction of the village. The officer had just sent a summons to Father Merlier to appear before him in his capacity as mayor of the commune. "Here is one of our men," he said, in a voice that was almost unintelligible from anger, "who was found murdered on the bank of the stream. The murderer must be found so that we may make a salutary example of him, and I shall expect you to cooperate with us in finding him." "Whatever you desire," the miller replied, with his customary impassiveness. "Only, it will be no easy matter." The officer stooped down and drew aside the skirt of the cloak, which concealed the dead man's face, disclosing as he did so a frightful wound. The sentinel had been struck in the throat, and the weapon had not been withdrawn from the wound. It was a common kitchen knife, with a black handle. "Look at that knife," the officer said to Father Merlier. "Perhaps it will assist us in our investigation." The old man had started violently, but recovered himself at once. Not a muscle of his face moved as he replied, "Everyone about here has knives like that. Like enough your man was tired of fighting and did the business himself. Such things have happened before now." "Be silent!" the officer shouted in a fury. "I don't know what it is that keeps me from applying the torch to the four corners of your village." His rage fortunately kept him from noticing the great change that had come over Françoise's countenance. Her feelings had compelled her to sit down upon the stone bench beside the well. Do what she would, she could not remove her eyes from the body that lay stretched upon the ground, almost at her feet. He had been a tall, handsome young man in life, very like Dominique in appearance, with blue eyes and golden hair. The resemblance went to her heart. She thought that perhaps the dead man had left behind him in his German home some loved one who would weep for his loss. And she recognized her knife in the dead man's throat. She had killed him. The officer, meantime, was talking of visiting Rocruz with some terrible punishment when 2 or 3 soldiers came running in. The guard had just that moment ascertained the fact of Dominique's escape. The agitation caused by the tidings was extreme. The officer went to inspect the locality, looked out through the still open window, saw at once how the event had happened, and returned in a state of exasperation. Father Merlier appeared greatly vexed by Dominique's flight. "The idiot," he murmured. "He has upset everything." Françoise heard him and was in an agony of suffering. Her father, moreover, had no suspicion of her complicity. He shook his head, saying to her in an undertone, We are in a nice box now. It was that scoundrel. It was that scoundrel, cried the officer. He has got away to the woods, but he must be found, or by the village shall stand the consequences. And addressing himself to the miller, Come, you must know where he is hiding. Father Merlier laughed in his silent way and pointed to the wide stretch of wooded hills. How can you expect to find a man in that wilderness? He asked. Oh, there are plenty of hiding places that you are acquainted with. I am going to give you 10 men. You shall act as guide to them. I am perfectly willing, but it will take a week to beat up all the woods of the neighborhood. The old man's serenity enraged the officer. He saw indeed what a ridiculous proceeding such a hunt would be. It was at that moment that he caught sight of Françoise where she sat, pale and trembling, on her bench. His attention was aroused by the girl's anxious attitude. He was silent for a moment, glancing suspiciously from father to daughter and back again. Is not this man, he at last coarsely asked the old man, your daughter's lover? Father Merlier's face became ashy pale, and he appeared for a moment as if about to throw himself on the officer and throttle him. He straightened himself up and made no reply. Françoise had hidden her face in her hands. Yes, that is how it is, the Prussian continued. You or your daughter have assisted him to escape. You are his accomplices. For the last time, will you surrender him? The miller did not answer. He had turned away and was looking at the distant landscape with an air of supreme indifference, just as if the officer were talking to some other person. That put the finishing touch to the latter's wrath. Very well, then, he declared. You shall be shot in his stead. And again, he ordered out the firing party. Father Merlier was as imperturbable as ever. He scarcely did so much as shrug his shoulders. The whole drama appeared to him to be in very doubtful taste. He probably believed that they wouldn't take a man's life in that unceremonious manner. When the platoon was on the ground, he gravely said, So then, you are in earnest? Very well, I am willing it should be so. If you feel you must have a victim, it may as well be I as another. But Françoise arose, greatly troubled, stammering, Have mercy, good sir. Do not harm my father. Take my life instead of his. It was I who assisted Dominique to escape. I am the only guilty one. Hold your tongue, my girl, Father Merlier exclaimed. Why do you tell such a falsehood? She passed the night locked in her room, monsieur. I assure you that she does not speak the truth. I am speaking the truth, the girl eagerly replied. I left my room by the window. I incited Dominique to fly. It is the truth, the whole truth. The old man's face was very white. He could read in her eyes that she was not lying, and her story terrified him. Ah, those children, how they spoiled everything with their hearts and their feelings. Then he said angrily, She is crazy. Do not listen to her. It is a lot of trash she is giving you. Come, let us get through with this business. She persisted in her protestations. She kneeled. She raised her clasped hands in supplication. The officer stood tranquilly by and watched the harrowing scene. Mon Dieu, he said at last, I take your father because the other has escaped me. Bring me back the other man, and your father shall have his liberty. She looked at him for a moment with eyes dilated by the horror which his proposal inspired in her. It is dreadful, she murmured. Where can I look for Dominique now? He is gone. I know nothing beyond that. Well, make your choice between them, him or your father. Oh my God, how can I choose? Even if I knew where to find Dominique, I could not choose. You are breaking my heart. I would rather die at once. Yes, it would be more quickly ended thus. Kill me, I beseech you. Kill me. The officer finally became weary of this scene of despair and tears. He cried, "Enough of this. I wish to treat you kindly. I will give you 2 hours. If your lover is not here within 2 hours, your father shall pay the penalty that he has incurred." And he ordered Father Merlier away to the room that had served as a prison for Dominique. The old man asked for tobacco and began to smoke. There was no trace of emotion to be descried on his impassive face. Only when he was alone, he wept 2 big tears that coursed slowly down his cheeks as he smoked his solitary pipe. His poor, dear child, what a fearful trial she was enduring. Françoise remained in the courtyard. Prussian soldiers passed back and forth, laughing. Some of them addressed her with coarse pleasantries, which she did not understand. Her gaze was bent upon the door through which her father had disappeared, and with a slow movement, she raised her hand to her forehead, as if to keep it from bursting. The officer turned sharply and said to her, "You have 2 hours. Try to make good use of them." She had 2 hours. The words kept buzzing in her ears. Then she went forth mechanically from the courtyard. She walked straight ahead, with no definite end. Where was she to go? What was she to do? She did not even endeavor to arrive at any decision, for she felt how utterly useless were her efforts, and yet she would have liked to see Dominique. They could have come to some understanding together. Perhaps they might have hit on some plan to extricate them from their difficulties. And so, amid the confusion of her whirling thoughts, she took her way downward to the bank of the Morel, which she crossed below the dam by means of some stepping stones which were there. Proceeding onward, still involuntarily, she came to the first willow at the corner of the meadow, and stooping down, beheld a sight that made her grow deathly pale, a pool of blood. It was the spot, and she followed the trace that Dominique had left in the tall grass. It was evident that he had run, for the footsteps that crossed the meadow in a diagonal line were separated from one another by wide intervals. Then, beyond that point, she lost the trace, but thought she had discovered it again in an adjoining field. It led her onward to the border of the forest, where the trail came abruptly to an end. Though conscious of the futility of the proceeding, Françoise penetrated into the wood. It was a comfort to her to be alone. She sat down for a moment, then, reflecting that time was passing, rose again to her feet. How long was it since she left the mill? 5 minutes? Or a half hour? She had lost all idea of time. Perhaps Dominique had sought concealment in a clearing that she knew of, where they had gone together one afternoon and eaten hazelnuts. She directed her steps toward the clearing. She searched it thoroughly. A blackbird flew out, whistling his sweet and melancholy note. That was all. Then she thought that he might have taken refuge in a hollow among the rocks, where he went sometimes with his gun to secure a bird or a rabbit. But the spot was untenanted. What use was there in looking for him? She would never find him, and little by little the desire to discover his hiding place became a passionate longing. She proceeded at a more rapid pace. The idea suddenly took possession of her that he had climbed into a tree, and thenceforth she went along with eyes raised aloft, and called him by name every 15 or 20 steps, so that he might know she was near him. The cuckoos answered her. A breath of air that rustled the leaves made her think that he was there and was coming down to her. Once she even imagined that she saw him. She stopped with a sense of suffocation, with a desire to run away. What was she to say to him? Had she come there to take him back with her and have him shot? Oh no, she would not mention those things. She would tell him that he must fly, that he must not remain in the neighborhood. Then she thought of her father awaiting her return, and the reflection caused her most bitter anguish. She sank upon the turf, weeping hot tears, crying aloud, My God, why am I here?" It was a mad thing for her to have come, and as if seized with sudden panic, she ran hither and thither. She sought to make her way out of the forest. 3 times she lost her way and had begun to think she was never to see the mill again, when she came out into a meadow directly opposite Rocreus. As soon as she caught sight of the village, she stopped. Was she going to return alone? She was standing there when she heard a voice calling her by name, softly, "Françoise! Françoise!" And she beheld Dominique raising his head above the edge of a ditch. Just God! She had found him. Could it be, then, that heaven willed his death? She suppressed a cry that rose to her lips and slipped into the ditch beside him. "You were looking for me?" he asked. "Yes," she replied bewilderedly, scarce knowing what she was saying. "Ah! What has happened?" She stammered with eyes downcast. "Why, nothing. I was anxious. I wanted to see you." Thereupon, his fears alleviated, he went on to tell her how it was that he had remained in the vicinity. He was alarmed for them. Those rascally Prussians were not above wreaking their vengeance on women and old men. All had ended well, however, and he added, laughing, "The wedding will be deferred for a week, that's all." He became serious, however, upon noticing that her dejection did not pass away. "But what is the matter? You are concealing something from me." "No, I give you my word, I am not. I am tired. I ran all the way here." He kissed her, saying it was imprudent for them both to remain there longer, and was about to climb out of the ditch in order to return to the forest. She stopped him. She was trembling violently. "Listen, Dominique, perhaps it will be as well for you to remain here after all. There is no one looking for you. You have nothing to fear." "Françoise, you are concealing something from me," he said again. Again, she protested that she was concealing nothing. She only liked to know that he was near her. And there were other reasons still that she gave in stammering accents. Her manner was so strange that no consideration could now have induced him to go away. He believed, moreover, that the French would return presently. Troops had been seen over towards Serval. "Ah, let them make haste. Let them come as quickly as possible," she murmured fervently. At that moment, the clock of the church at Rocreus struck 11. The strokes reached them, clear and distinct. She arose in terror. It was 2 hours since she had left the mill. "Listen," she said with feverish rapidity. "Should we need you, I will go up to my room and wave my handkerchief from the window." And she started off homeward on a run, while Dominique, greatly disturbed in mind, stretched himself at length beside the ditch to watch the mill. Just as she was about to enter the village, Françoise encountered an old beggar-man, Father Bontemps, who knew everyone and everything in that part of the country. He saluted her. He had just seen the miller, he said, surrounded by a crowd of Prussians. Then, making numerous signs of the cross and mumbling some inarticulate words, he went his way. "The 2 hours are up," the officer said, when Françoise made her appearance. Father Merlier was there, seated on the bench beside the well. He was smoking still. The young girl again proffered her supplication, kneeling before the officer and weeping. Her wish was to gain time. The hope that she might yet behold the return of the French had been gaining strength in her bosom, and amid her tears and sobs, she thought she could distinguish in the distance the cadenced tramp of an advancing army. Oh, if they would but come and deliver them all from their fearful trouble. "Hear me, sir. Grant us an hour, just one little hour. Surely you will not refuse to grant us an hour." But the officer was inflexible. He even ordered 2 men to lay hold of her and take her away, in order that they might proceed undisturbed with the execution of the old man. Then, a dreadful conflict took place in Françoise's heart. She could not allow her father to be murdered in that manner. No, she would die in company with Dominique, rather, and she was just darting away in the direction of her room in order to signal her fiancé when Dominique himself entered the courtyard. The officer and his soldiers gave a great shout of triumph, but he, as if there had been no soul there but Françoise, walked straight up to her. He was perfectly calm, and his face wore a slight expression of sternness. "You did wrong," he said. "Why did you not bring me back with you? Had it not been for Father Bontemps, I should have known nothing of all this. Well, I am here, at all events." 5. It was 3 o'clock. The heavens were piled high with great black clouds, the tail end of a storm that had been raging somewhere in the vicinity. Beneath the coppery sky and ragged scud, the valley of Rocrous, so bright and smiling in the sunlight, became a grim chasm full of sinister shadows. The Prussian officer had done nothing with Dominique beyond placing him in confinement, giving no indication of his ultimate purpose in regard to him. Françoise, since noon, had been suffering unendurable agony. Notwithstanding her father's entreaties, she would not leave the courtyard. She was waiting for the French troops to appear, but the hours slipped by. Night was approaching, and she suffered all the more since it appeared as if the time thus gained would have no effect on the final result. About 3 o'clock, however, the Prussians began to make their preparations for departure. The officer had gone to Dominique's room and remained closeted with him for some minutes, as he had done the day before. Françoise knew that the young man's life was hanging in the balance. She clasped her hands and put up fervent prayers. Beside her sat Father Merlier, rigid and silent, declining, like the true peasant he was, to attempt any interference with accomplished facts. "Oh, my God!" Françoise exclaimed. "They are going to kill him." The miller drew her to him and took her on his lap as if she had been a little child. At this juncture, the officer came from the room, followed by 2 men conducting Dominique between them. "Never, never!" the latter exclaimed. "I am ready to die." "You had better think the matter over," the officer replied. "I shall have no trouble in finding someone else to render us the service which you refuse. I am generous with you. I offer you your life. It is simply a matter of guiding us across the forest to Montredon. There must be paths." Dominique made no answer. "Then you persist in your obstinacy?" "Shoot me and have done with the matter," he replied. François, in the distance, entreated her lover with clasped hands. She was forgetful of all considerations save one. She would have had him commit a treason. But Father Merlier seized her hands that the Prussians might not see the wild gestures of a woman whose mind was disordered by her distress. "He is right," he murmured. "It is best for him to die." The firing party was in readiness. The officer still had hopes of bringing Dominique over and was waiting to see him exhibit some signs of weakness. Deep silence prevailed. Heavy peals of thunder were heard in the distance. The fields and woods lay lifeless beneath the sweltering heat. And it was in the midst of this oppressive silence that suddenly the cry arose. "The French! The French!" It was a fact. They were coming. The line of red trousers could be seen advancing along the Sauval road at the edge of the forest. In the mill, the confusion was extreme. The Prussian soldiers ran to and fro, giving vent to guttural cries. Not a shot had been fired as yet. "The French! The French!" cried Françoise, clapping her hands for joy. She was like a woman possessed. She had escaped from her father's embrace and was laughing boisterously, her arms raised high in air. They had come at last, then, and had come in time, since Dominique was still there, alive. A crash of musketry that rang in her ears like a thunderclap caused her to suddenly turn her head. The officer had muttered, "We will finish this business first." and with his own hands pushing Dominique up against the wall of a shed, had given the command to the squad to fire. When Françoise turned, Dominique was lying on the ground, pierced by a dozen bullets. She did not shed a tear. She stood there like one suddenly rendered senseless. Her eyes were fixed and staring, and she went and seated herself beneath the shed, a few steps from the lifeless body. She looked at it wistfully. Now and then she would make a movement with her hand in an aimless, childish way. The Prussians had seized Father Merlier as a hostage. It was a pretty fight. The officer, perceiving that he could not retreat without being cut to pieces, rapidly made the best disposition possible of his men. It was as well to sell their lives dearly. The Prussians were now the defenders of the mill, and the French were the attacking party. The musketry fire began with unparalleled fury. For half an hour, there was no lull in the storm. Then a deep report was heard, and a ball carried away a large branch of the old elm. The French had artillery, a battery in position just beyond the ditch where Dominique had concealed himself, commanded the main street of Rocreuse. The conflict could not last long after that. Ah, the poor old mill! The cannonballs raked it from wall to wall. Half the roof was carried away. 2 of the walls fell in. But it was on the side toward the Morel that the damage was greatest. The ivy, torn from the tottering walls, hung in tatters. Debris of every description floated away upon the bosom of the stream, and through a great breach Françoise's chamber was visible with its little bed, the snow-white curtains of which were carefully drawn. 2 balls struck the old wheel in quick succession, and it gave one parting groan. The buckets were carried away downstream. The frame was crushed into a shapeless mass. It was the soul of the stout old mill parting from the body. Then the French came forward to carry the place by storm. There was a mad hand-to-hand conflict with the bayonet. Under the dull sky, the pretty valley became a huge slaughter pen. The broad meadows looked on affrightedly, with their great isolated trees and their rows of poplars dotting them with shade, while to right and left the forest was like the walls of a tilting ground enclosing the combatants. And in nature's universal panic, the gentle murmur of the springs and watercourses sounded like sobs and wails. Françoise had not stirred from the shed, where she remained hanging over Dominique's body. Father Merlier had met his death from a stray bullet. Then the French captain, the Prussians being exterminated, and the mill on fire, entered the courtyard at the head of his men. It was the first success that he had gained since the breaking out of the war. So, all afire with enthusiasm, drawing himself up to the full height of his lofty stature. He laughed pleasantly, as a handsome cavalier like him might laugh, and, perceiving poor idiotic Françoise, where she crouched between the corpses of her father and her betrothed, among the smoking ruins of the mill, he saluted her gallantly with his sword and shouted, "Victory! Victory!